The dinner rush had just started when she tied her apron a little tighter and stepped onto the restaurant floor. The place was small but always busy. Plates clinked, glasses tapped against each other, and conversations blended into one steady wave of sound. The smell of grilled food and fresh bread filled the air. To most people, it was just another normal evening. To her, it was another long shift she needed to survive. She had already worked since early morning. Her feet were sore, and there was a dull ache running through her body that she had been trying to ignore for 2 days. But she kept smiling. She always did. Customers liked her because she was polite and calm. She never complained. Even when people were rude, she simply nodded and walked away. Very few people knew what her life looked like after she clocked out. At home, her mother lay in bed most days, weak and needing medicine they could barely afford. Her younger siblings still went to school and depended on her for everything. Bills were stacked in a drawer in the kitchen, and every shift meant one less worry for a few hours. Calling in sick was not an option. Resting was not an option. Pain was something she had learned to push aside. 2 nights earlier, she had slipped on the back stairs while carrying a heavy box. She landed hard. The manager asked if she was okay, and she forced a smile and said yes. But the pain had grown worse since then. Walking felt tight and sharp at the same time. Sitting was uncomfortable. Still, she showed up. Missing work would mean losing tips. Losing tips meant losing groceries. That evening, the door opened, and the room changed. It wasn't loud at first. It was quiet. Conversations slowed. A few heads turned. A group of men walked in together, dressed sharply, moving with confidence. In the middle of them was a man everyone in town knew about, though few spoke about him openly. People called him a powerful businessman. Others whispered different titles behind closed doors. Whatever the truth was, one thing was certain. When he entered a room, people noticed. The manager rushed forward with a nervous smile and led them to the largest table. The staff exchanged quick looks. No one argued about who would serve them. The manager made the choice. She was assigned their table. For a second, she stood still near the counter, steadying herself. She took a quiet breath and picked up her notepad. This was just another table, she told herself. Just another order. As she approached, she felt the weight of their presence. The man in the center sat back in his chair calmly, observing everything around him. His expression was unreadable. The others spoke loudly, laughing in a way that drew attention. She greeted them softly and asked for their order. Her voice didn't shake, even though her body felt weak. One of the men made a comment under his breath that made her uncomfortable, but she ignored it. She had heard worse before. She wrote everything down carefully and walked back toward the kitchen. Halfway there, a sharp pain shot through her lower body. She paused near an empty table and pressed her hand against the edge for support. Her vision blurred slightly. She told herself it would pass. It had to pass. She delivered their drinks and returned with their food, step by careful step. Each movement felt heavier. When she placed the final plate on the table, she tried to straighten up, but her legs trembled. The room seemed louder suddenly, or maybe it was quieter. She couldn't tell. She took one step back, and the pain became unbearable. Her knees buckled before she could stop herself. She grabbed the side of a chair but missed. She fell to the floor near their table, the tray slipping from her hand and clattering loudly against the tiles. Gasps filled the restaurant. For a moment, she couldn't move. The pain was sharp and deep, making it hard to breathe. Tears rushed to her eyes without permission. She tried to sit up, but her body refused. The manager hurried over, whispering her name urgently. Customers stared. Some stood. A few pulled out their phones, unsure of what they were seeing. She felt embarrassed more than anything. Embarrassed that she had caused a scene. Embarrassed that she had fallen in front of everyone. She tried to pull herself together, but when she attempted to bring her legs closer, a cry escaped her lips. "I can't close my legs, it hurts," she sobbed softly, barely aware that the whole room had gone silent. The words hung in the air. The laughter at the table stopped immediately. The powerful man who had been leaning back in his chair slowly sat forward. His expression changed, not to anger or annoyance, but to focus. He looked at her carefully, as if trying to understand what others were missing. The manager knelt beside her, asking what happened. She shook her head, apologizing over and over. "I'm sorry. I'm fine. I just need a minute," she whispered, even though tears kept falling. But she wasn't fine. The man at the center of the table stood up. Chairs scraped against the floor as his group shifted nervously. Everyone expected him to be upset about the disruption. A few customers held their breath, waiting for a reaction. Instead, he stepped closer, stopping a short distance away. He didn't touch her. He didn't raise his voice. He simply asked, calmly, "How long have you been in pain?" His voice was firm but not cruel. She hesitated. No one had asked her that before. People usually asked if she could continue working, not how she felt. "A few days," she admitted quietly. The manager looked shocked. "Why didn't you say anything?" he whispered. She lowered her eyes. Because she needed the job. Because she couldn't afford a doctor. Because missing a shift was worse than hurting. The room felt heavy with guilt. Some customers looked down at their plates. Others watched closely. The man glanced at the manager. "Call a doctor," he said simply. The manager blinked. "A doctor? Yes, now." There was no anger in his tone, only certainty. Within minutes, one of his men stepped outside, already making a call. The restaurant buzzed with quiet whispers. No one expected this. They expected shouting, maybe even blame. They did not expect concern. She tried to protest. "Please, I'm okay. I don't want trouble." He looked at her steadily. "This isn't trouble," he replied. "Pain is not something you hide." Those words settled into the room differently than anything else that night. She had spent so long pretending she was strong enough to handle everything alone. Hearing someone say she didn't have to hide it made something inside her break even more than the fall had. The manager helped her sit up carefully while they waited. The powerful man remained standing nearby, watching to make sure no one crowded her space. His group stayed unusually quiet. Outside, headlights appeared sooner than expected. As the doctor hurried in with a small medical bag, the restaurant doors swung open, letting in cool night air. Customers stepped aside, making room. She felt exhausted, both from the pain and from the sudden attention. Part of her wished she could disappear. Another part felt a strange relief. For the first time in days, she wasn't pretending anymore. As the doctor knelt beside her and gently began asking questions, she closed her eyes for a second. The dinner rush no longer mattered. The spilled tray didn't matter. The whispers didn't matter. All that mattered was that someone had finally noticed she was hurting. And in a small restaurant that had seen hundreds of ordinary nights, this one was quietly becoming something no one would ever forget. The restaurant no longer sounded like a restaurant. The usual noise of plates and soft music had faded into whispers and careful footsteps. The doctor who had arrived so quickly was now kneeling beside her, speaking in a calm and steady voice. He asked simple questions: where exactly it hurt, how long the pain had been there, whether she had fallen or lifted something heavy. She answered slowly, her words shaky but honest. When she mentioned slipping on the back stairs 2 nights earlier, the manager's face turned pale. He remembered that night clearly. It had been busy, and she had insisted she was fine. He had wanted to believe her because he needed every staff member on the floor. Now guilt pressed down on him like a heavy weight. The doctor gently examined her and frowned slightly. He didn't say anything alarming, but his serious expression said enough. "She needs proper medical attention," he said quietly to the manager and the man standing nearby. "This isn't something that should be ignored." Ignored. That word seemed to echo in the air. She had ignored it. The manager had ignored it. Even the pain itself had tried to warn her, and she had ignored that too. Not because she didn't care about herself, but because life had taught her that survival came first. The powerful man watched closely. His eyes moved from the doctor to her face. She looked small sitting there on the restaurant floor, apron slightly stained, hair falling loose from the rush of the evening. She wasn't trying to get attention. She wasn't trying to cause drama. She looked embarrassed more than anything. "Can she walk?" one of the men from the table asked quietly. The doctor shook his head. "Not safely." Without hesitation, the powerful man turned toward the entrance and made a short phone call. His voice was low, controlled. Within minutes, a car pulled up outside. Not flashy, not loud, just waiting. Inside the restaurant, customers were unsure what to do. Some offered quiet prayers under their breath. Others stood up from their tables to give space. A woman near the window wiped tears from her eyes, whispering that the girl had served her many times and always looked tired. The manager leaned closer to her. "Why didn't you tell me it was this bad?" he asked softly. She swallowed. "If I miss work, I don't get paid," she replied. It wasn't said with anger. It was just the truth. That simple sentence made the silence even deeper. The powerful man heard it too. His jaw tightened slightly, but he said nothing harsh. Instead, he bent down just enough so she wouldn't have to strain her neck to look up at him. "Your job is safe," he said firmly. "Right now, your health matters." She wasn't used to hearing those words. In her world, health came after rent, after groceries, after medicine for someone else. She nodded slowly, though she still looked unsure. The doctor and 2 staff members carefully helped her onto a chair so she could be moved without more pain. Every small movement made her wince, but she tried not to cry again. She didn't want to look weak in front of everyone. As they carried her toward the door, the restaurant parted like a quiet sea. Customers stepped back respectfully. No one filmed now. No one whispered loudly. The mood had changed. It no longer felt like gossip. It felt personal. Outside, the night air was cool. The city lights flickered in the distance. She was placed gently into the waiting car, the doctor climbing in beside her. Before the door closed, she looked back at the restaurant through tearful eyes. It felt strange leaving in the middle of a shift. The powerful man stood near the car for a moment. "Take her to the best hospital nearby," he instructed calmly. "Make sure they run every test." One of his men nodded and stepped into the driver's seat. As the car drove away, the restaurant doors slowly shut again. Inside, no one returned to normal immediately. The manager stood still, replaying everything in his mind. He thought about how often she had picked up extra shifts without complaint, how she never once asked for a day off, how he had mistaken her silence for strength. At the hospital, bright lights replaced the warm glow of the restaurant. Nurses moved quickly, guiding the wheelchair through clean hallways. Forms were brought forward, questions asked, signatures required. She grew nervous again. Hospital visits meant bills. Bills meant stress she could not handle. She tried to sit up straighter, insisting she didn't need special treatment. But when a nurse quietly told her that everything was being taken care of, she froze. "Taken care of?" she repeated softly. "Yes," the nurse replied. "You don't need to worry." The words felt unreal. Meanwhile, back at the restaurant, the powerful man returned to his table, but no one touched their food. The mood had shifted too much. One of his men finally spoke. "Why get involved?" he asked carefully. The powerful man didn't answer right away. He looked down at the untouched plates, then at the doorway where she had been carried out. "Because no one else did," he said simply. The statement wasn't loud or dramatic. It was calm, but it carried something heavy behind it. At the hospital, doctors ran scans and tests. The earlier fall had caused more damage than she realized. The pain she had been walking on could have led to serious complications if left untreated. She lay quietly as machines hummed around her, staring at the ceiling. For the first time in days, she wasn't rushing anywhere. She wasn't balancing trays or counting tips. She wasn't pretending to feel fine. She was just there, forced to rest. A nurse adjusted her blanket and asked if she wanted to call someone. She hesitated, then gave her mother's number. She didn't want to worry her, but she knew she had to explain why she wouldn't be home soon. When her mother answered, fear filled her voice immediately. But after hearing that she was receiving proper care, her tone softened into relief and quiet tears. "You always carry too much alone," her mother whispered through the phone. Maybe that was true. Back at the restaurant, customers slowly began leaving. Some placed extra money on the table before walking out. The manager noticed and felt his chest tighten again. The powerful man stood up to leave as well. Before stepping out, he turned to the manager. "Make sure your staff are safe," he said. "Working hard shouldn't mean working injured." The manager nodded quickly. It won't happen again. Outside, the city felt different than it had earlier that evening. Word had already begun spreading quietly. Not rumors, not fear. Just the simple story of a waitress who collapsed and a man no one expected stepped forward. At the hospital, she finally allowed herself to close her eyes. The pain medication was beginning to ease the sharpness. Her body felt heavy but safe. She didn't know what would happen next. She didn't know how long recovery would take. But for the first time in a long while, she wasn't alone with her pain. And somewhere across town, the man people feared most sat quietly in his car, staring out at the passing streetlights, lost in thoughts he hadn't revisited in years. Something about that night had stirred old memories. And this was only the beginning. Morning light slowly filled the hospital room. The curtains were half open, letting in a soft golden glow. The machines beside her bed beeped quietly, steady and calm. She blinked a few times, trying to remember where she was. Then the events of the night before came rushing back. The fall, the silence in the restaurant, the car ride, the bright hospital lights. For a moment, she felt embarrassed all over again. She tried to sit up slightly, but a gentle voice stopped her. A nurse stepped forward and adjusted her pillow. "Easy," she said kindly. "You went through a lot last night." Her body still ached, but the sharp pain had lessened. Felt different now, managed, under control. That alone felt strange. She wasn't used to pain being treated so quickly. A doctor entered soon after, holding a tablet. He explained everything clearly and slowly. The fall had caused a serious strain and internal swelling. It wasn't something that would heal on its own without rest and proper care. If she had kept working like that for another week, it could have become much worse. She listened quietly, her hands resting on the blanket. Each word made her realize how close she had been to long-term damage. She had been walking, serving, lifting trays, smiling through something that could have put her in a far more serious condition. "You'll need rest," the doctor said firmly. "No heavy movement. No long hours on your feet. Rest." The word sounded almost impossible. As if reading her thoughts, the doctor added, "You don't need to worry about the bills. Everything has been arranged." There it was again, that reassurance. After he left, she stared at the ceiling. She didn't know how to feel. Relief mixed with confusion. Gratitude mixed with pride. She had always handled her own problems. Accepting help felt unfamiliar. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. She expected a nurse. Instead, the door opened slowly, and he stepped inside. He wasn't surrounded by anyone this time. No group, no loud presence. Just him, dressed simply, hands in his coat pockets. He closed the door behind him quietly. For a second, neither of them spoke. He looked around the room, then at her. She looked smaller in the hospital bed than she had in the restaurant. Not because she was weak, but because she finally allowed herself to rest. "How are you feeling?" he asked. His voice was calm, the same steady tone from the night before. "Better," she replied softly. "Thank you." There was a pause. She wasn't sure what to say next. How do you speak to someone everyone fears? How do you thank someone like him? "You didn't have to do all this," she finally said. He pulled a chair closer and sat down, not too near, just enough to talk without raising his voice. "Yes, I did," he answered simply. She studied his face. It wasn't cold the way people described. It wasn't angry either. It looked tired. Not physically tired, but like someone who had carried memories for a long time. "You work too hard," he said after a moment. She almost laughed at that. "I don't have much choice." He nodded slowly. "Most people don't. That doesn't mean they should suffer quietly." His words settled in her mind. Suffer quietly. That had been her way for years. Handle everything alone. Don't complain. Don't ask for help. Keep moving. He looked toward the window, then back at her. You reminded me of someone. She didn't interrupt. My sister worked in a place like that, he continued. Small restaurant. Long hours. She slipped once too. Said she was fine. Kept working. He stopped speaking for a few seconds. The silence felt heavy, but not uncomfortable. She didn't tell anyone how much pain she was in. By the time we realized, it was too late to fix it easily. She carried that injury for years. There was no dramatic tone in his voice. Just honesty. She hated asking for help, he added quietly. Thought it made her weak. The room felt smaller now but warmer. She swallowed gently. I didn't want to lose my job. You won't, he said firmly. I already spoke to the manager. Her eyes widened slightly. What did you say? That your position stays. And you'll be paid while you recover. She stared at him, unsure if she heard correctly. Paid? While not working. That sounded impossible. I can't accept that, she whispered automatically. You can, he replied. And you will. His tone wasn't forceful. It was protective. She looked down at her hands. For the first time in years, she felt something shift inside her. Not dependence. Not weakness. Something softer. Maybe trust. Outside the hospital room, nurses moved quietly down the hallway. Inside, time felt slower. Why does everyone think you're... She hesitated, unsure of the right word. Cruel? He finished calmly. She didn't answer, but her silence was enough that he leaned back slightly in his chair. Because sometimes I have to be strong in ways people don't understand. But strength doesn't mean ignoring pain. She let that sink in. For a long time, she believed strength meant pushing through anything, no matter the cost. But maybe strength also meant knowing when to stop. A gentle knock came at the door. A nurse entered with medication and a small cup of water. He stood up immediately, giving space. There was no need for him to stay during routine care. Before leaving, he turned back toward her. Focus on healing, he said. The rest will be handled. She nodded, unsure how to fully express what she felt. After he left, she lay back against the pillow. The room felt different now, not because of money or power, but because someone had taken her pain seriously. Later that afternoon, her mother arrived at the hospital. Her eyes were red from crying, but relief filled her face when she saw her daughter sitting up and stable. They held hands quietly for a long time. You don't have to carry everything alone, her mother whispered again. This time she didn't argue. Over the next few days, she began physical therapy sessions inside the hospital. The movements were slow and careful. Each stretch reminded her how close she had come to something worse. The therapist encouraged patience. Recovery isn't weakness, the therapist said one morning. It's rebuilding. Meanwhile, changes quietly began happening at the restaurant. The manager installed better lighting near the back stairs. Non-slip mats were added. Shift hours were reorganized to avoid overworking staff. It wasn't announced loudly. It just happened. Customers who had witnessed the night of her collapse started asking about her. Some left small notes with the manager wishing her well. Word spread not about scandal but about compassion. A week later, as she practiced standing without support, she realized something important. The pain had forced her to stop, but stopping had allowed her to see things clearly. She wasn't just a worker. She wasn't just someone trying to survive. She was a human being who deserved care. One evening, as she sat by the hospital window watching the sunset, her phone buzzed with a simple message from the manager. Take your time. We're waiting for you. She smiled softly. For the first time in years, she believed that returning to work wouldn't mean returning to silence. And somewhere across town, the man everyone thought they understood sat alone in his office, looking at an old photo on his desk, a younger version of himself standing beside a smiling sister in a waitress uniform. Some wounds never fully disappear, but sometimes, helping someone else heal makes your own memories a little lighter. And this story was far from over. The days in the hospital slowly turned into a steady routine. Morning checkups, light exercises, short walks down the hallway with careful steps. At first, Every movement felt uncertain, like her body didn't fully trust itself yet. But with each passing day, the pain became less sharp and more distant, like a memory fading into the background. She began noticing small things she never had time to notice before. The sound of nurses laughing softly at the front desk. The way sunlight moved across the floor in the afternoon. The quiet hum of machines that once scared her but now felt comforting. For the first time in years, she wasn't rushing. She wasn't balancing trays or counting tips in her head. She was simply healing. Her mother visited every day, sometimes bringing homemade soup in a small container. They talked more than they had in months. Not about bills, not about stress, just about simple things. Childhood memories, funny neighbors, dreams they once had but forgot to chase. It felt like something had slowed life down long enough for them to breathe. One afternoon, as she was finishing a therapy session, the therapist smiled and said, "You're improving faster than expected." She felt proud hearing that. Not because she was strong enough to ignore pain, but because she had finally allowed herself to care for her own body. Later that same day, there was a knock on her hospital door again. She knew who it was even before he stepped inside. He entered quietly as he had done before. No loud entrance. No group of men following him. Just a simple nod in greeting. "You look stronger," he observed. "I feel stronger," she replied. And this time there was a small smile on her face. He sat down in the chair near the window. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. It wasn't awkward. It felt natural, like two people who had shared something difficult. "The manager told me the changes have been made," he said. She tilted her head slightly. "Changes? Safer flooring, better lighting, shorter shifts. No one works injured anymore." Her eyes widened. She hadn't known the details. She knew he had spoken to the manager, but she hadn't realized how much had changed. "You didn't have to do all that," she said softly. "Yes, I did," he replied, the same calm certainty in his voice as before. "What happened to you shouldn't happen to anyone else." She looked down at her hands, thinking about the other staff members. The dishwasher who worked 2 jobs. The cook who barely took breaks. The new girl who was always nervous during busy hours. Maybe her fall had forced something important to shift. "I don't want people thinking I caused trouble," she admitted. He leaned forward slightly. "You didn't cause trouble. You revealed a problem." That sentence stayed with her long after he left that day. As the week continued, she grew more confident walking on her own. The doctor explained she would need a little more time before returning to full shifts, but she could soon leave the hospital and continue recovery at home. When discharge day arrived, she felt both excited and nervous. The hospital had become a place of safety. Going home meant stepping back into real life again. But this time, things felt different. When she reached home, neighbors stopped by to ask how she was doing. Word had spread gently through the community. Not in a dramatic way, but in a human way. People were curious, but also caring. At the restaurant, small changes were visible even from the entrance. A new safety sign near the stairs. Brighter lights in the hallway. Posted schedule showing fairer shifts. It looked like someone had taken time to think. The manager called her a few days later, not to ask when she could return, but to ask how she was feeling. "We'll adjust your hours when you come back," he said. No pressure. That alone made her throat tighten. One evening, while resting at home, she received a small envelope delivered by hand. Inside was a simple card. No fancy design. Just a short message written clearly. "Strength is knowing when to stop and when to stand again." There was no signature. There didn't need to be. She sat with that card for a long time, reading it over and over. For years, she believed standing meant pushing through pain. Now she understood that sometimes standing meant choosing yourself. Meanwhile, across town, the powerful man found himself thinking about that night more often than he expected. He remembered the way the restaurant had gone silent. The look of embarrassment on her face. The way she kept apologizing for being hurt. He visited his sister that weekend. She was older now, living quietly in another part of the city. When he told her what had happened, she listened carefully. "You did what you wished someone had done for me," she said gently. He didn't respond right away. I wasn't strong back then, she added. You were, he replied. You just didn't have support. Those words felt heavy, but freeing. Back at home, she continued her exercises daily. Some days were harder than others. There were moments of frustration when her body felt stiff or slow. But she reminded herself that healing was not a race. One afternoon, she stood in front of the mirror and tried putting on her work apron again, just to see how it felt. The fabric rested lightly against her waist. Instead of fear, she felt readiness. She wasn't returning as someone desperate to survive. She was returning as someone who understood her worth. Before her first day back, the manager called a short meeting with the staff. He didn't mention names or details. He simply reminded everyone that their health mattered. That no shift was worth permanent damage. That speaking up was not weakness. When she walked into the restaurant again, the room felt familiar but changed. The staff greeted her warmly. A few customers recognized her and smiled kindly. She noticed something else too. People were more patient. When a plate arrived late, no one complained loudly. When someone spilled a drink, customers waited calmly. It was as if that night had reminded everyone that behind every uniform was a person. Later that evening, as she carried a tray carefully across the floor, she felt steady. Not just physically but emotionally. The door opened once more. The room didn't freeze this time. He walked in alone and chose a small table near the window. She approached with calm steps, not fear. How are you feeling? He asked again. But this time it felt like a simple question between two people, not a powerful man and a waitress. Stronger, she answered. He nodded once, satisfied. There was no dramatic speech, no big scene, just quiet understanding. As she walked back toward the kitchen, she realized something important. That night she fell had not been the worst moment of her life. It had been the moment everything changed. And sometimes, change doesn't come through loud arguments or public drama. Sometimes it comes through one simple act of care. And it was still leading them toward something even more powerful. The evening air felt different the night everything came full circle. The restaurant was busy again, but not in the same rushed, careless way it used to be. There was still laughter, still the sound of plates and glasses, but something softer existed underneath it now. People seemed more aware, more patient. She moved carefully but confidently between tables, balancing a tray with steady hands. Her steps were no longer forced through pain. They were natural again. Every now and then she paused for a second, not because she had to, but because she allowed herself to breathe. It had been several weeks since her return. Her hours were shorter. Her posture was stronger. She even smiled differently now. Before, her smile felt like something she put on for customers. Now it felt real. The back stairs had bright lights installed. The floor had new mats that gripped her shoes. Even the manager seemed calmer. He no longer pushed staff to ignore discomfort. If someone said they felt unwell, they were told to rest. It was a quiet shift in culture, but it was powerful. That night, the door opened again. Conversations didn't stop this time. No heavy silence filled the room, but heads still turned slightly. He walked in alone. No group, no dramatic entrance. Just a simple nod to the manager before choosing a small table near the middle of the room. Not the biggest table. Not the most private one. Just a regular seat. She noticed him right away. For a brief second, her heart beat faster, but not from fear. From recognition. From understanding that this moment mattered. She picked up a menu and walked toward him with steady steps. "Good evening," she said gently. "Good evening," he replied. There was something lighter in his expression now. Not as guarded. She handed him the menu, though she suspected he didn't need it. "Would you like the usual?" she asked softly. He almost smiled. "You remember." "Yes," she said. "Some things are easy to remember." He nodded, then studied her for a moment. "How is the pain?" "Gone," she answered honestly. "Just a small reminder sometimes. But it doesn't control me anymore." He seemed satisfied with that. As she walked back toward the kitchen, she realized how different this felt from the first night. That night had been filled with fear and confusion. This one felt calm. Around them, customers continued eating and talking. A family celebrated a birthday at the corner table. A couple near the window held hands across their plates. Life was happening normally. When she returned with his meal, she placed it carefully in front of him. Their eyes met briefly. "Thank you," he said. She hesitated for a second, then spoke quietly. "No, thank you." He looked at her, slightly surprised. "For seeing me," she added. The words were simple, but they carried weight. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he leaned back in his chair and looked around the restaurant. He noticed the improved lighting, the relaxed staff, the way people treated each other with a little more kindness. "It wasn't just me," he finally said. "You forced everyone to notice." She thought about that. She hadn't meant to force anything. She had simply reached her limit. But sometimes reaching your limit shows others what needs to change. The manager approached their table briefly, checking if everything was satisfactory. His posture was straighter these days, his voice calmer. He thanked the man for his earlier advice without making it a public show. After finishing his meal, the man didn't rush to leave. He sat quietly for a while, watching the room like he was memorizing it. She cleared a nearby table, then returned with the check. He placed the payment inside without looking at it. Before she could step away, he spoke again. "I won't always be around to step in," he said calmly. She understood what he meant. "You don't need to be," she replied. "People are already different." He studied her face carefully. She wasn't the exhausted, frightened girl who had fallen to the floor weeks ago. She looked stronger now, not because she had learned to endure pain, but because she had learned to speak when something wasn't right. As he stood to leave, something unexpected happened. One of the older customers, a man who had been there the night she collapsed, slowly stood up. He began clapping softly. It wasn't loud or dramatic, just a simple, steady clap. A woman at another table joined him, then someone else. Within seconds, the sound spread through the room. It wasn't applause for power. It wasn't applause for money. It was applause for compassion. She felt her throat tighten as she looked around. Some customers smiled at her. Others nodded at him. A few wiped away quiet tears. He looked slightly uncomfortable with the attention, but he didn't stop it either. After a moment, the clapping faded naturally. He turned to her one last time. "Take care of yourself," he said. "I will," she promised. He walked toward the door without another word. No grand exit. No dramatic music. Just a simple step into the night. The restaurant returned to its normal rhythm, but something had shifted permanently. She stepped outside during her short break later that evening. The cool air brushed against her face. She looked down the street where his car had disappeared. Weeks ago, she had been lying on that restaurant floor, ashamed and in pain. She thought that moment would define her in the worst way. Instead, it had become the moment that changed everything. She went back inside and finished her shift with steady energy. At the end of the night, as she untied her apron, the manager handed her a small envelope. "What's this?" she asked. "From the staff," he said. Inside was a simple card signed by everyone who worked there. It read, "Thank you for reminding us that we matter." Tears filled her eyes again, but this time they weren't from pain or embarrassment. They were from something deeper. She realized that night had not just been about her injury. It had been about visibility, about dignity, about the idea that no one should feel invisible while they are hurting. At home, she placed the card next to the earlier one she had received. Strength is knowing when to stop and when to stand again. She finally understood it fully. Strength wasn't about pretending nothing hurt. Strength wasn't about staying silent to keep a job. Strength was about allowing yourself to be human. The next morning, she woke up without fear of pain. She stretched gently and felt steady. Life wasn't suddenly perfect. Bills still existed. Responsibilities remained. But she no longer felt alone inside them. And somewhere in the city, a man with a reputation built on fear carried a quiet reminder that compassion can be stronger than power. The restaurant continued serving meals. Customers continued coming and going. But anyone who had been there that night would always remember the moment a simple cry for help changed more than one life. Not because of money, not because of influence, but because someone chose to care. And sometimes that is enough to make everyone cry.